I spoke with House Armed Services Committee members Mike Turner yesterday. He gave me his take on the president's handling of the tensions with Iran. Where is the president on this, in your view, in terms of the potential military answer?
Well, I think he's in the right place, and that is both he has very strict sanctions in place. He's increasing those. He's working with our European allies, and he's calling for Iran to come to the table so that we can renegotiate the nuclear deal to ensure that there is no nuclear Iran. And also very clearly calling out the dangerous malign activities of Iran that are destabilizing in the Middle East, calling on them to, of course, end their dangerous military actions that has resulted in the tanker attacks and the drone attacks. So he's giving them both an out. At the same time, he's putting on pressure and indicating that he's willing to use military force.
Joining us right now is Florida Congressman, House Armed Services Committee member, former White House policy advisor for Defense Secretaries Gates and Rumsfeld, and former Green Beret himself, Michael Waltz. Good to see you, sir. Thanks very much for all of your service to our great country.
Thank you.
Give me your sense of the seriousness of the situation. Do you expect this to end or at some point turn to military conflict?
Well, I do think the Iranians will continue to push. They're like a schoolyard bully that will continue taking lunch money until they're stopped. So that was some of my concern with not conducting the strike, was that at some point the Iranians will have to be met with force. They are emboldened by weakness, and they are deterred by strength. But I do fully support the president and his maximum pressure campaign. The sanctions are working. Inflation is sky high in the Iranian economy right now. Its oil exports have gone from 2.5 million per day to 200,000 to 400,000. So a marked decrease in its ability to export its oil, and it's dealing with daily labor unrest throughout Iran and throughout the economy. And the most important thing that I'm encouraged is we're getting consistent reporting of its proxies, Hezbollah, the Shia militias all over the Middle East and in Iraq, not being able to make its payroll because Iran no longer is flush with cash to support terrorism across the region.
Wow.
Congressman, good morning. Mitch Rochelle. One of the things that these sanctions do is actually penalize those, and I'm talking about the escalated sanctions that the president tweeted about over the weekend, that penalizes those who trade with Iran, and hopefully putting those people on sort of our side. Do you think that's an effective strategy to put pressure on Western European trading partners of Iran to get them to put pressure in turn on Iran themselves to back off the rhetoric?
I do think so, and I'm encouraged to see the president going to those secondary sanctions. We have to remember, and I remind my Democratic colleagues of this all the time, the reason that Iran came to the table in 2012 for the Iran deal in the first place was that we were uniform around the world in terms of the sanctions. They became desperate. The thing that the regime cares about the most is not the Iranian people. It's its own pocketbook and its own survival. And once they became desperate, they do two things. One, they try to externalize and create a crisis somewhere else that diverts its populace and hopefully, from their perspective, unifies them. That's what they're doing now. They've done it before, whether it was the Beirut bombings in the 80s or attacking U.S. soldiers in Iraq. But secondly, they finally came to the table, and the president has been very clear. That's where he hopes to get them again, but this time we will cut a better deal that will also deal with its ballistic missile program, its support for terrorism, and again, that right now, as we speak, Iran is holding Americans hostage. A Princeton PhD student, a UN worker, and others. All of those things need to be covered, and that's what the Iran deal so badly missed.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that. I mean, Jackie, you've covered energy and the oil space for a long time. It's amazing to me that this is a country that has the potential. It has one of the biggest oil and gas reserves of any country. Yeah. They could be an incredibly rich nation. They don't use that money, and they don't sell that oil and use that money for the people. Instead, they use it on supporting terrorism.
They do, and I think the problem is that you're not dealing with a regime that's looking at this in a rational way or like a business. It's religiously motivated, and those deep-rooted and deep-seated religious values really have sort of taken over. And when that happens, you see how drastic and how dire it becomes.
Yeah.
Congressman, I want to throw a question back at you regarding these the retaliation that the U.S. was considering last week for the drone strikes. How do you think the Chinese and the Russians read American intentions when they see us considering a retaliatory strike but then pulling back? Is that seen as a sign of strength, of humanitarian considerations, or is it seen as a sign of weakness?
Well, I think from their perspective, they're looking at what are the president's red lines, and it's an indicator for them of what's proportional. And this is consistent. Actually, the president has been consistent in this regard. We sent a message through the Omani government to the Iranians that this was coming, to give them an opportunity to kind of clear those bases, those radar and missile installations out. He did the same thing for the strikes in Syria in response to the chemical attacks that gave the Russians a chance to move their soldiers out. So the president has been very clear he does not want to escalate, but at the same time, we do have to respond and we do have to show strength. But at the end of the day, he does want to use this as leverage to drive people back to the table and have a diplomatic solution. So for everyone wringing their hands that this president is a warmonger, I think he's showing them that they're absolutely wrong, but that he will use a military option if pushed, and the United States will respond. And I think that is a very kind of clear-eyed and pragmatic approach.
What about defense spending and the debate around that? The Democrat-controlled House passing a nearly $1 trillion spending package for fiscal 2020 last week. This bill is allocating $733 billion to defense and national security, $17 billion less than what the White House requested. 0 Republicans voted for this bill. Congressman, your take? Is this something you would vote on?
I didn't vote for it.
Right.
I voted no. It's $17 billion less than what the president requested and what the Senate is considering. And really, my issue with it was it seeks to tie the president's hand as commander-in-chief all over the place, from shutting down Guantanamo to repealing the authorization for the use of military force, which is an authorization for us to conduct counterterrorism activities, to seeking to overly tie the president's hands on Iran. You know, it really was politics at its worst, frankly, and really going after, I think, the president in a very personal way. So I voted no, but at the end of the day, I think we as a country have to take, and us as leaders have to take a hard look at how do we continue to fight extremism, modernize and keep pace with China, but also have a nuclear deterrent with Russia, while overlaid with $22 trillion in debt and growing. And that, to me, is the strategic question of the day that we have to get to the bottom of, setting politics aside.
And as strategic is, of course, the question around debt. Let me ask you, Congressman, real quick. Yeah. Do you think if the president gets a second term, he's going to try to attack the entitlements? I mean, putting defense spending here, putting other spending there. I mean, something's got to give, right? Given $22 trillion in debt.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Maria, because this is all the discretionary part of the budget. What's blowing up our debt is the non-discretionary, the mandatory spending, which has all of those pieces. And really what's within that is the exploding cost of health care. Whether that's in our entitlements, it's the fastest growing part of our defense budget.
So you think the president will try to attack it? You think the president?
I think so. Well, he's going to get at the cost of health care, and that does not mean for the government to absorb it, like Medicare for all, and pass it through in additional taxes. Really getting it, driving down the cost, whether it's portability, selling across state lines, all of those pieces is what he's going to get at.
Congressman, it's great to get your insights on everything. Thank you.
All righty.
Congressman Michael Waltz joining us there.